So thanks for the introduction and the opportunity to come and speak to you about some of the work that I've been doing over the last while. I thought I'd give an overview of some of the work that we do in marine robotics and in particular in collecting high resolution seafloor imagery from sites around the country, trying to answer questions around changing climates, impacts of oceanographic changes in oceanographic conditions and the like. I know that Dare in particular is interested in the use of probabilistic methods in some of this modeling. So I'll talk a little bit about how we use or exploit some of those sorts of models in planning deployments and the like. But I thought I'd start, for those who aren't familiar, with just a brief overview of the Australian Centre for Field Robotics, or I think officially the name is Australian Centre for Robotics, still ACFR, expanding our focus from field robotics out into a broad range of different areas. We're one of the largest robotics groups in the world. The ACFR was founded in the late 90s. We've got about 130 staff across, academics, research fellows, PhD students, and I think kind of uniquely for a university lab of this sort, we have a very strong complement of technical staff who essentially build equipment and help us with a lot of the field work that we do. We work across a broad range of areas, both in the university and around the world, really, and focus on both the fundamental sciences of robotics, machine learning, AI, but also, I think, as you'll see hopefully through some of my talk, we have a very strong focus on applied research. So taking the learnings in robotics and really trying to understand how they can be deployed to have impactful benefits for society. You see a few of the sorts of systems that we've worked on over the years, unmanned air vehicle systems, a lot of work in mining, agriculture, and the like. For those who aren't familiar with the work more broadly of the center, this is sort of a montage of videos showing examples of the sorts of work that we do. In the top left, there's an example of a mid-air refueling maneuver by a couple of unmanned air vehicles down at our Marulan site. So we have testing facilities and paved runways and the like down near Goulburn. We do a lot of work in the top right on precision agriculture and agriculture automation using machine learning to direct sampling, weeding, spraying, those sorts of activities. In the bottom left, you see some examples of our autonomous driving work, where we're working on both on-road applications of autonomy, but also in campus-like environments, sort of small vehicles in less structured environments. So you might imagine, small vehicles being used on a university campus or in the airport to transport a sporting field to transport people around. And of course, my work is mainly focused on marine. So I'll focus the rest of this talk mainly on marine robotics, but there's a huge range of activities across the center in various different application domains. So the focus of our marine robotics work over the past probably 2 decades really is focused on platforms and sensing. So we're a robotics group. We like to build vehicles. We like to build payloads. We like to investigate how different sensors can be brought to bear in understanding natural environments. We do a lot of work in navigation and mapping, taking the information provided by the vehicles and turning that into landscape scale models of the environment. We do a lot of work in planning and control. So thinking not only about how an individual vehicle operates in an environment, but also how you can plan whole campaigns to be most efficient in the way that you collect the data. A lot of my students have been working on sort of data analytics, so how to, getting pretty good at deploying robots, collecting data. How do you draw insights from the data that they're collecting and work with stakeholders to understand or to provide insights into what's happening in these environments. And as you'll see, hopefully we do applications across a broad variety of areas of ecology, archaeology, geoscience. We do a little bit of defense-related work as well, but we work with a large group of Australian and international collaborators. So collaboration has been really at the core of a lot of what we've done over the years. We were quite fortunate to be part of National Collaborative Research Infrastructure Scheme funded program called the Integrated Marine Observing System. So this was established in 2007 as part of the the launch of the NCRIS program. I think the numbers have probably grown since this slide was first put together. It's probably north of $250 million invested in infrastructure to support the marine sciences in Australia. And that program has been renewed through recent increases in NCRIS funding. IMOS was set up as a bunch of facilities. So there was funding for moorings and gliders and ships of opportunity and Argo floats. And we'd acquired an autonomous underwater vehicle just around the time NCRIS was launching. We went along to the initial sort of IMOS meetings, and today we could help deploy these vehicles. And so we were funded from 2007 till 2023 to run a program of benthic observing. So basically taking robotic systems to spots around the country, deploying these vehicles and collecting really one of the world's largest archives of marine seafloor imagery. We have done repeat surveys at sites around the country, really trying to understand how these environments are changing. We had a focus on reefs, submerged reefs in coastal environments, so down to about 300 meters. I don't think I have examples. We have done deeper water work, but typically we've been focused, a lot of our work has been on sort of relatively shallow water operations, from tropical environments in the north of Australia all the way through temperate regions in the south. All of this data is available online. I'll show some examples of sort of the tools and things that we've been developing for that. So all this is freely available to the community. We've also, on the basis of the work that we've done, been invited to participate in a lot of work around the world, focused on support for studies in ecology, archaeology, and deep water geoscience. In Australia, it's mainly been ecology. We've also done some work in Japan and in Hawaii and the Americas, looking at sort of monitoring ecological habitats. Some of the deep water work we've done, we were invited to be part of some work offshore Fukushima, looking at the impacts of the tsunami, and some of the impacts on habitats there. And then in Okinawa, we've done a lot of work in archaeology in the Mediterranean and the Caribbean. And this has been involved quite a number of different platforms. So we've both taken our robots to some of these places, but also provide sensors and systems to work with some of our collaborators. And I'll show examples of some of this work that we've done over the years. So a lot of our work's really started out with building tools to provide detailed maps of underwater environments. So here's an example, and this is a few years old now, but essentially what you see here is an example of a track that the vehicle has flown. We fly our vehicles about 2 meters off the seafloor, taking overlapping stereo images. We stitch that together. The stereo gives us both the imagery, but also the three-dimensional structure of the seafloor. So on the bottom here, you see the bathymetry derived from the imagery we collected, and then we can overlay that with textured meshes. And the vehicle is essentially programmed, in this case, to travel a few hundred meters along, taking images. Then it completes a dense survey. These are kelp beds in Tasmania. And we can sort of design these sorts of deployments depending on the questions that are being asked by our key stakeholders. And the imagery that we're collecting is sub-millimeter resolution, so very high resolution imagery, and we can derive quite detailed three-dimensional structure from the data that we're collecting. One of the things that's been a hallmark of a lot of the work we've done is repeat surveys. So in the northeast of Tasmania, there's significant changes in habitats being as a result of oceanographic warming. So a lot of warm waters being transported down the East Australian coast. This has resulted in an explosion of urchin numbers in the northeast of Tasmania and resulting in barrens. So we were asked to come and help map some of these barrens areas. So what you're seeing here is an area that's about, I think, 15,000 square meters, so about 50 by 30 meters of sea floor, where the vehicle's just tracked back and forth. We've done this during the day. Now, historically, this would have been covered in kelp, but the urchins are at sort of a population density that they basically destroy the kelp, and then they come out at night and they feed on the algae and prevent the reestablishment of these kelp forests. So here's an example of a survey we did during the day. We came back 12 hours later. If I kind of flick back and forth, you can see, we have a quite precisely registered, georeferenced plot. And the obvious thing that stands out is that the urchins, which during the day are kind of hiding in crevices, at night they come out and they're feeding on this algae on the rocks. So we can highlight a particular area of this model. We can then look at the behavior of these urchins, and in fact, we see sea cucumbers and all kinds of other things that are coming out during the night. So that's a relatively short time frame where we can go back and explore the behavior of, in this case, these urchins. We've also done a lot of work looking at much longer term repeat surveys. So here's an example from Western Australia. There was a significant warming event. This is 15 years ago now, but we've repeated these surveys. And I think the latest of the surveys out in WA was in 2022 or 23. But what we saw in those early days was we did a survey in 2010. Towards the end of 2011, there was a significant warming event, resulted in extensive bleaching along the West Australian coast. We were able to do repeat surveys, and our vehicles could go back to within about a half a meter from year to year. We can then study or help provide data to help study the sort of interaction or the evolution of these reefs. So here you can see that the plate corals have extensively bleached, and as you look across the years, the plate coral which bleached is clearly not recovering, but you can see these sort of branching corals growing quite strongly into the niches that have been freed up by the bleaching of the plate coral. So we're providing data that's quite difficult to collect otherwise, particularly at depths beyond which you can dive. And we also have the three-dimensional structural data, so we can look at how the structural complexity of the reefs are evolving over time. We've also taken some of these techniques. We have been working with some colleagues from St. Andrews University and the University of Hawaii at Lizard Island up in the north of Barrier Reef. In 2014, we were scheduled to be on Lizard Island doing surveys, and a cyclone went straight over the island. So we had to sort of reschedule our trip, but essentially went up a week after the cyclone, surveyed sites all around Lizard Island. In this case, we came up with a technique. We have taken robots up there, but we've also used our graduate students as sort of cheap robots. So here what we've done is we've taken a little pole, we put a string around a drum, attached that to a camera system, and then we basically just swim around in a circle. We end up having an estimate from a GPS on a little antenna that tells us approximately where each image was taken. We use photogrammetry techniques to then refine the estimate of where each image was taken. And in about 15 minutes, we can cover an area of about 130 square meters. And so it's a relatively quick technique for collecting this sort of data. From the imagery, we can then generate these 3D reef records, we're calling them. So this is a three-dimensional model of a bit of reef in quite significant detail. So you can see, individual coral colonies. And in addition to the imagery, we have that 3D structural complexity. So we can actually look at the structure of the reef. We've been back. I do have an updated version of this slide. We've been back basically every year out to 2023, I think, and we're planning to be out there again this year in November. But in addition to sort of the cyclone, and there was a cyclone in 2014, another one in 2015, and we thought, this would be an interesting study of sort of reef recovery after a significant disruption from a cyclone. Unfortunately, then there was bleaching in the Barrier Reef from 2016 through 2018 approximately. So in 2016, the reef looked like this. There was essentially no coral. It all got wiped out by both the cyclone and some of the bleaching activity. But by looking at our data sets through time, we can look at in 2016, there wasn't much coral in this area. This is a register, the same area of seafloor. In 2018, we can start to see a couple of little bits of coral coming back. In 2019, we're starting to see much more significant sort of recruits. And then in 2021, we can really look at how these reefs are evolving through time. This is another bit of that reef. And again, you can see sort of by 2021, a significant recovery of coral in these sites. And if I put those sort of last couple of years together, you can see really significant changes in these reefs that are facilitated by the fact that we can go back to the same bit of the seafloor. We can build these big models of the environment and then register them through time. So that's been a big part of our work, is building these sort of models and accurately georeferencing the data so that we can compare it through time. We've also looked at much longer timescales. So this was a paper that was published a few years ago now in Nature Climate Change, where people were using the imagery that was collected along the New South Wales and Tasmanian coast. They were finding key ecological, key species, so ascidians and sponges and things like that, characterizing the population densities along this stretch of coast, and then applying climate change models to predict what the environment, the oceanographic conditions would be in sort of a 50-year time frame. And as a consequence, predicting what the latitudinal range of these sorts of species might be. So really using the data that we've got now of the presence and absence of particular species and climate change models to predict what might happen in the future. So I think some really interesting work at very long time scales in predicting species distribution and changes in some of these habitats. As I mentioned, a lot of our work, we can build maps, we can collect data, but one of the things that we recognize is that we're not going to be able to look at every bit of the seafloor. It's just, impossible. It's an enormous amount of area to cover. So one of the things we have to be careful about is how we use the time that we have at sea. So we think about planning and control both in context of a single vehicle. So here's one of our platforms. This is the AUV Sirius. It was built for us by the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, but has been extensively modified here at the university. The imaging systems and the like were all built here. You can see the vehicle operating over relatively rough terrain. This is actually in Greece. This particular video was taken when we were surveying a first century BC shipwreck. But you can see the vehicle operating relatively close to the seafloor. You can see the strobes. Hopefully that's coming through in the video, illuminating the seafloor. And I'll show an example of the outcome of this work. So we think about control both in the context of a single vehicle, but also in terms of planning, multi-vehicle deployment. So we've done work with the Schmidt Ocean Institute in Hawaii and in Australia as well, where we've had multiple vehicles being deployed, so gliders, multiple AUVs, surface vessels, thinking about how you plan those deployments. We still are in a situation where we have many more people than robots, but you can envisage a future in which the robotic systems are kind of reliable, long range. It can be deployed with fewer people supporting the operations. But we've got, from that particular cruise, we had, AUVs and floats and surface vessels, and all of this was sort of coordinated on the bridge using mapping tools that allowed us to plot the position of vessels, all the vehicles, all overlaid on detailed bathymetric maps, which allowed us to really understand where all the assets were, to track them through time. This was all a web-based interface, so anywhere on the ship we could kind of bring up maps showing where all the equipment was and how it was being deployed, and provide us with a good interface with the bridge, because there was an awful lot happening on this particular trip. And I think that ability to localize and track all of our assets while they're underway is an important part of the work that we're doing. Another thing that we've been working on is on using semi-supervised techniques to model the relationship between things that we're seeing in the imagery and the underlying bathymetry. So this is something we worked with Jody on I don't know, that's got to be almost 20 years ago now, Jody, where we're trying to understand the relationship between what we're seeing in the imagery and the underlying bathymetry. So here we've got a fully unsupervised pipeline that takes imagery, clusters that imagery according to your features in the images. And then we're also doing a similar thing in the bathymetric space, basically training one of these autoencoders to find a latent space that describes the structure of the seafloor. And then we're learning relationships between what we see in the imagery and the underlying bathymetry. And so if we get these clusters and we ask someone to label them, we find clusters that kind of make ecological sense. So we see sand kind of looks pretty similar to its the images are characteristic of sand. Those kind of cluster together in a particular part of the image space. We get some of these patchy reefs, and kelp also shows up. We can then take the label that's assigned to each image, plot it against the AUV transects. So you can see here that we've got sort of coherent structure emerging, or coherent distributions of some of these image types. So this reef and patchy reef kind of are, if you look at the underlying bathymetry, there's a pretty strong correlation between where we're seeing the reef and the underlying structure. And then we can use those labels to then predict where we might see examples of those different habitats. We're actually building fully probabilistic models of the underlying bathymetry. We're also looking then at the uncertainty associated with those predictions. So we look at both the aleatoric and epistemic uncertainty, one of which represents essentially the uncertainty in the prediction, and the other represents the uncertainty in the model parameters. So if I have an area of flat seafloor that sometimes has sand and sometimes has a screw shell rubble, and you can't tell from the bathymetry, then the uncertainty of that is, it'll be 50-50. We can't tell which one's which, but we're quite sure that it's one of those two things. So what we want to do is drive further sampling to drive down the uncertainty in the model parameters, rather than relying on just the uncertainty in the label itself, because there are parts of these models where we're never going to be able to tell the difference unless we go and look at absolutely every pixel in the model. So we're using these notions of uncertainty to drive sampling. We've done that in a few different instances. We've started to think about how you bootstrap that process. So how do you use the bathymetry to then do your first deployments before you know anything, so that you're covering representative areas of the sea floor. And we've done that in the context not just of AUV deployments, which are relatively expensive. We've been thinking about, what if we get rid of a lot of the expensive bits of our AUVs and we turn this into relatively low-cost drifting floats. So we've done some work designing a low-cost imaging float. So this thing, for a few $1,000s, we can throw it in the water. It has essentially 1 degree of freedom. It controls its depth. It's got a little altimeter, and it gets driven along by the ocean current. So rather than prescribing a particular pattern, we deploy these things. They go down. They float along, collecting imagery. We can track them from a surface vessel, and we've done things like this where we build 3D reconstructions of. This is in Chowder Bay and Sims, so you can see a lot of rubbish on the sea floor. We've also been up at Coffs Harbour. So these guys just drift along collecting imagery. And what we've done is actually deploy these offshore. We had a surface vessel with the capability to deploy and recover these floats. So the idea was to take oceanographic models of current and to deploy the floats in places where we expect them then to drift across reefs of interest. So we did some work with colleagues at UTS who were doing the modeling aspect, and then deployed these floats from a surface vessel. We did some trials off of Port Jackson down in the south of Sydney. So here we had some bathymetric data. We were deploying the floats. They're going along, taking images of the seafloor and just drifting collecting imagery of kelp and boulder fields. And here what we're trying to do is sort of close the loop on that probabilistic modeling. So we had some prior imagery from an AUV deployment. And then all of these little dots here represent imagery collected by the drifting floats. And we had essentially sand, reef, and kelp in this imagery. And what we're trying to do is close the loop between observation, estimation of where we see things, and planning for future deployments. So to do this, we had our prior deployments. We then said, okay, well, we think there's a high degree of uncertainty in this part of the model. So we deployed the floats there, collected more data. We then refined our estimate. So of where things were uncertain, we then deployed the floats again, and et cetera. So we're actually sort of closing the loop on the modeling and the deployments and collection of further data. And this allows us then we can then cluster all that imagery from both the AUV as well as the floats into sand, reef, and kelp. And you can see, out wide where the bathymetry is flat, we're mostly seeing sand. In the bathymetric areas, in the deeper waters, we're seeing mostly reef without kelp. And then up in the shallower areas, these yellow dots are sort of kelp covered. So we're building a prediction of the habitat type based on the information we've got. We're then doing further deployments, refining the model, and then deploying again. Hopefully that kind of makes sense. We've also taken those techniques and we were invited to do some work in Greece on the Colombo caldera near Santorini. So here we've got bathymetric models of a volcanic caldera. We've clustered the underlying bathymetric structure into a variety of different sort of characteristic structure. We've looked at where there's been hydrothermal activity documented in the past. And in this case, what we've done is actually predicted where there might be hydrothermal activity. And the team here deployed their ROVs and actually found new hydrothermal activity that had been previously undocumented based on combining our predictions of where we thought there would be this hydrothermally active seafloor based on the bathymetric structure. So pretty exciting stuff. And we were working with a group that was developing a planning framework that allowed us to sort of predict where we should deploy these assets. So, planning, there's a lot of uncertainty in planning in the real world, characterizing that uncertainty, getting informative priors is challenging. Sometimes it's pretty hard to define the objective functions, and so there's a lot of exciting research I think still to be done in this planning space. As I mentioned, a lot of the students that I work with, they're interested in machine learning and AI. They like to do the kind of data analytics stuff. We do a lot of work in making all this data available online, in providing tools so that people can annotate the data, share their annotations, and develop machine learning backends. We've done a lot of work on both supervised and unsupervised modeling of this data. So really trying to help people understand the distribution of these habitats. We've done some work. This is a PhD student who recently submitted, who is taking the AUV imagery, building these 3D reconstructions, but also training a convolutional neural network to detect lobsters. So here's some examples of imagery with lobsters. So we basically took a few hundred images, put a box around the lobsters. The CNNs then are pretty good at finding these things, even in relatively complex imagery. We can then find images with the lobsters, and then given that we have three-dimensional structure, we can learn relationships between the underlying structure of the seafloor and where these lobsters are hanging out. We do have to be a little bit careful because the classifiers aren't always perfect, and sometimes they come up with these sponges and say, well, this looks kind of like a lobster. So we have to be a little bit careful in the way that we interpret this data. We've also been doing work on unsupervised domain adaptation. So if we have one vehicle in a particular environment, how do we use the machine learning classifiers that we train on a particular data set how well do those generalize across to different platforms, different imaging systems? And often there's a process of retraining. So I've been doing some work in this area as well. So, and there's challenges with data analytics, which we're addressing. There's a relatively small amount of labeled data compared with some of these big models that people train in terrestrial environments. Underwater environments, there's usually not as much data, particularly not as much labeled data to work with. So transfer learning across data sets, multimodal learning. So we're learning relationships between imagery and bathymetry, for example. Some interesting work still, I think, to be done in that area. And I've focused on a lot of these different challenges. And as a roboticist, one of the adages, particularly in the marine robotics area, is that you want your number of deployments to be equal to the number of recoveries. You want to get your gear back at the end of the day. A lot of this is pretty expensive equipment, and we work in a variety of different conditions. So these are two images from working in the Bass Strait. Either it can be mill pond like very easy deployment, or it can be absolutely raging and pretty challenging. And so we have to be careful about our deployments. We've had instances, this was in southern Tasmania, where we basically bounced the AUV off the side of the boat in a rough recovery, had some pretty extensive damage, managed to kind of patch things up and get back in the water the following day. Now, I mentioned our work in Antikythera. So here's an example of this work. So we were invited to bring one of our AUVs in 2014 and 2015. We were at Antikythera, and I noticed they've just been doing some further work there this year. They had a field season there. So we essentially deployed our vehicle. We collected about 10,000 square meters of imagery, built detailed three-dimensional models of the wreck site. So there's amphora and the anchor stock and pottery shards from this wreck, which has been dated to 83 BC, and which this thing called the Antikythera mechanism was discovered on this site. This is one of the models that we built. So here's this anchor stock. This is a big bit of lead that would have kind of weighed the anchor down. So they actually recovered this. They recovered a variety of artifacts. And subsequent to our work there, they actually did some excavation and discovered nearly complete human remains from 2,000 years ago on the site. So, pretty exciting project to be part of. In 2015, we returned to the site. So we had done sort of one season where we built this model. We knew there was some additional artifacts had been documented further south. So we planned out a bunch of dives and managed to cover quite an extensive area of reef. The archaeologists were documenting where they were finding our artifacts on the seafloor. And you can see there's almost certainly two separate wrecks on this site. One of the big challenges is that getting the deployments and making sure that we get our vehicle back is sometimes a bit of a challenge. And what we were provided with was a bathymetric map of the site. So you can see there's this bit of a bench here. This is right up against a cliff. So we're kind of within about 100 meters of sort of the shore of the Antikythera Island. And this shadow here actually is a significant underwater cliff. And so we planned all of our deployments based on this bathymetric data to try and build a map of this bench area where we knew the wreck was. But the vehicle went down, headed out, was maintaining its 2-meter altitude, and suddenly the bottom dropped out. And it's a relatively naive vehicle. It drove down from about 70 meters to about 80 meters of water depth, it then turned around as we'd instructed it to do, and it came up against the cliff, and then it stopped. And so we tried to abort it, and it ended up not coming back to the surface. We deployed a small ROV, and this is the video that we took from the ROV. So I'm on the surface with a joystick, driving this vehicle down. And here you can see the AUV up against the cliff. And if you look closely, draped over the vehicle is some fishing line. So it's actually driven up underneath this fishing line, which has been caught on the reef and gotten itself stuck. And at the time, we didn't have good protocols to kind of reprogram it. So we had this remotely operated vehicle. We went in, we kind of ummed and ahed about how best to free the AUV. Came in with the grabber on this ROV, grabbed the vehicle's antenna, drove the ROV down, which pushed the AUV down, and then we're able to disentangle the vehicle. So, sometimes we have to be a bit judicious in how we plan these deployments, particularly around significant structures like this. And then there's lots of examples where people haven't got their gear back, particularly as people start to work in much deeper waters. In sort of 10 kilometers, the pressure is enormous, and there's been some significant losses of equipment over the years. We've misplaced our vehicles a couple of times. Once in Southeast Queensland, we were doing work off Morton Island. The vehicle it resurfaced at the end of the deployment, but then there was a change, we think, related to significant rain the evening before in the buoyancy, and the vehicle ended up on the bottom. This is the end of a week of operations. I'd flown back to Sydney. I got a call saying, well, the vehicle's on the bottom. We have no fuel. We're going to have to leave it. And I said, no, please stay. But in the end, got overruled by the skipper. He said, no, we need more fuel. By the time they came back, we have a drop weight, which drops off the vehicle, makes it more buoyant. It had moved from where it was last seen. We called the water police. They said, well, based on the wind patterns, it's probably tracking to the south. We got in touch with Cyro, who said, no, the oceanographic currents are probably pushing it north. We did a lot of aerial surveys, spent a few days trying to look for the vehicle, didn't find it. And then about a week later, we got a call from the Sunshine Coast, which is about 100 kilometers north of where we lost the vehicle, that it had washed up on shore. So very fortunate to have gotten our vehicle back at that point. Looks pretty beat up, but we brought it back to the workshop, replaced some of the outer fairings and things, and we're back in the water within a couple of months. So I think, despite all of these challenges, outstanding successes, lots of great science has been done and supported by marine robotic platforms. It's a lot of fun and quite rewarding. I think, if I kind of bring all these challenges together, we're doing good stuff in terms of vehicles and operations and coordinated deployments of platforms. We're doing quite well in building these maps of the vehicles in the planning and control. But I think all the little yellow tildes are kind of areas of further research and areas of potential further development. And so, understanding how we can potentially work with DARE in some of this environmental modeling work would be great to have some discussions on. We're thinking about long-range autonomous marine teams. So rather than having a whole crew on a boat tending a single platform, we'd like to get to the point where we're deploying multiple platforms and monitoring their progress remotely. There's a lot of work around the world that looks to be supporting this. So long-range AUV deployments, both in Bahrain and Southampton have AUVs that are capable of in excess of 1,000 kilometers and weeks or months of deployments. There's been some pretty amazing work in unmanned surface vessels that can be used to sort of complement the undersea assets. And I think thinking about these coordinated teams and how you can get really the right data, I think is something to be thought about. We're doing some work in underwater intervention, working with Reef Robotics, the Sydney-based startup who are developing these underwater manipulators. So thinking about how do you plan and reason around significant structures. And then we've also been doing work on developing relatively low cost and highly maneuverable AUVs. So here's an example of one of our latest platforms. This was developed through a Trusted Autonomous Systems Defense CRC, but there are certainly opportunities to deploy these sorts of platforms Here we're manually driving the vehicle into sort of a confined space, but it gives you a sense of the maneuverability of this particular platform, which is pretty unique for a vehicle of this sort of shape and the ability to operate in close proximity to the seafloor. This vehicle is currently in New Zealand, and I got a team heading over there tomorrow, and then they're off to Tonga with a philanthropic organization called the Inkfish Foundation, who are supporting some of the development of and build of a couple more of these platforms. So I think, you know, marine robotics presents great tools for collecting interesting data. I think that sort of probabilistic modeling aspect and the data analytics, the sort of insights you can draw is I think where a lot of the exciting research is for us. Future challenges in long-range autonomous teams, machine learning tools for multimodal data. We've been doing some work recently also with, I didn't show, with hyperspectral imagery, so actually deploying hyperspectral imaging systems underwater and looking at how that can inform the classification of the benthic environments. Thinking about the operational tempo of autonomous marine systems, going to multiple platforms, being supported by small teams, and then that autonomous intervention. So as we start to get into manipulation, and you know, can we start to work on either sample collection or interaction with marine infrastructure? And you know, we're always on the lookout for good PhD and postdocs, and I think more broadly across the ACFR, I think there's lots of opportunities and interesting research going on. So happy to take some questions and answer any, you know, have a discussion about how we might find opportunities to work together.